In the suffocating silence of a military armory, where the smell of gun oil mixed with fear, a young woman's steady hands moved across cold metal. She had cleaned hundreds of rifles before, her movements precise and practiced. But this time was different. This time, as her cloth caught on a small patch sewn into her uniform vest, a decorated general's face went pale as death. What he saw in that moment would shatter everything she thought she knew about her past, her family, and the war that had torn her country apart. Some secrets are buried so deep that even those carrying them don't know they exist. Until a single thread unravels everything. The morning sun cast long shadows across the concrete floor of the Central Military Base's armory, as Sarah Chen methodically disassembled the AK-74 rifle laid out before her. At 23, she had been working as a civilian weapons maintenance specialist for nearly 2 years, her small hands surprisingly adept at handling the complex machinery of war. The job paid well enough to support her aging grandmother, and it kept her close to the military world that had somehow always felt like home, though she could never quite understand why. Sarah's fingers moved with practiced efficiency, removing the bolt carrier group and setting it aside on the clean white cloth spread across her workstation. She had learned this routine from Master Sergeant Rodriguez, who had taken her under his wing when she first applied for the position. Treat every weapon like it could save a life, he had told her on that first day, because someday it just might. The armory hummed with quiet activity around her. 3 other maintenance specialists worked at their own stations, the soft sounds of metal against metal creating a rhythmic backdrop to their labor. Overhead, fluorescent lights buzzed intermittently, casting the windowless room in harsh, clinical brightness. It was not a place for conversation or friendship. It was a place where precision mattered more than personality. Sarah picked up her cleaning rod and began working on the rifle's barrel. Her movements automatic after hundreds of similar procedures. She wore the standard-issue maintenance vest over her civilian clothes, a practical garment with numerous pockets for tools and supplies. The vest had been issued to her on her first day, already worn and faded from previous users. She had never paid much attention to the small details sewn into its fabric. As she worked, Sarah's mind wandered to the evening ahead. Her grandmother had promised to make dumplings for dinner, a tradition they shared every Friday when Sarah's work schedule permitted. It was one of the few connections she had to her Chinese heritage. Grandmother's stories were often fragmented, interrupted by long pauses, and distant stares that suggested painful memories she preferred not to revisit. The sound of heavy footsteps interrupted her concentration. General Marcus Hartwell strode through the armory, his presence immediately commanding the attention of everyone present. Even the civilian contractors straightened their postures instinctively when he passed. Sarah had seen him before during his irregular inspections, but they had never spoken directly. He was a man whose reputation preceded him, a career military officer who had served in 3 different conflict zones and was known for his exacting standards and sharp memory. General Hartwell moved between the workstations, observing the maintenance procedures with the keen eye of someone who understood that equipment failure could mean the difference between life and death for soldiers in the field. His uniform was immaculate, his bearing straight and authoritative. When he reached Sarah's station, she continued working but remained aware of his scrutiny. "What's your assessment of this weapon, Miss Chen?" he asked, his voice carrying the crisp authority of command. Sarah looked up from her work, meeting his gaze briefly before returning her attention to the rifle. "The barrel shows normal wear patterns, sir. Some carbon buildup in the gas system, but nothing unusual for a weapon of this age and usage level. The trigger mechanism is functioning properly, and there are no signs of stress fractures in the receiver." General Hartwell nodded, seemingly satisfied with her technical assessment. He watched as she continued her cleaning procedure, her movements confident and sure. Sarah reached for a cleaning patch from one of the pockets in her maintenance vest, the motion causing the fabric to shift slightly. It was then that something changed in the general's expression. His eyes fixed on a small section of Sarah's vest, specifically on what appeared to be a patch sewn near the left shoulder. The patch was faded and partly obscured by wear, but it was clearly visible enough to catch his attention. Sarah, focused on her work, did not notice the subtle shift in his demeanor. General Hartwell's face went very still. The color seemed to drain from his weathered features, and his breathing became shallow and controlled. For a man known for his composure under pressure, the change was striking. He continued to stare at the patch on Sarah's vest, his mind racing through memories that he had not accessed in over 2 decades. The patch bore a distinctive design, a stylized phoenix rising from flames, surrounded by Chinese characters that most Americans would not be able to read. But General Hartwell could read them. He had learned to read them during his deployment in Southeast Asia 24 years earlier, when he was a young lieutenant involved in humanitarian operations following a devastating regional conflict. Sarah continued her methodical cleaning, unaware that the man standing beside her workstation was experiencing something akin to shock. She wiped down the rifle's components with practiced care, occasionally glancing at the instruction manual even though she knew the procedures by heart. The routine was comforting, predictable, in a life that had often felt uncertain and incomplete. "Where did you get that vest?" General Hartwell asked suddenly, his voice strained in a way that was completely uncharacteristic. Sarah looked up, surprised by the question and by something in his tone that she could not identify. "It was issued to me when I started working here, sir." "Standard maintenance gear." "No," he said, his voice gaining intensity. "That patch. Where did that patch come from?" Sarah looked down at her vest, confused. She had never paid particular attention to the various patches and markings that adorned the garment. "I'm not sure, sir. The vest was already like this when I received it. Is there something wrong?" General Hartwell did not answer immediately. He continued to study the patch with an intensity that was beginning to make Sarah uncomfortable. Around them, the other maintenance workers had begun to take notice of the unusual interaction. The general's behavior was so far outside the norm that it was creating a palpable tension in the room. "Stand up!" General Hartwell commanded, his voice barely above a whisper. Sarah complied, setting down her cleaning supplies and rising from her chair. The general moved closer, his eyes never leaving the patch on her vest. He reached out as if to touch it, then stopped himself, his hand hovering inches from the fabric. "Sir?" Sarah asked, genuinely concerned now by his strange behavior. The patch depicted a phoenix with outstretched wings, its head turned skyward in a pose of determination and hope. The Chinese characters beneath it read, "Forever in our hearts," a phrase that carried deep meaning for those who understood its context. General Hartwell understood that context all too well. His mind transported him back to a refugee camp in 1990, where he had worked as part of an international relief effort. The camp had housed families displaced by ethnic violence, many of them ethnic Chinese who had fled persecution. Among them had been a young mother with her infant daughter, both wearing distinctive patches that identified them as members of a particular community that had suffered tremendous losses. The woman's name had been Li Mei Chen. She had been injured during her escape and was suffering from complications that the camp's medical facilities were not equipped to handle. General Hartwell, then Lieutenant Hartwell, had worked with the medical team to arrange for her transport to a better-equipped hospital in the region, but she had been too weak to travel with her infant daughter. In her final conversation with the young lieutenant, Li Mei Chen had pressed a small patch into his hands, the same phoenix design that now adorned Sarah's vest. She had begged him to help ensure that her daughter would be safe, that someone would remember where she came from and who her mother had been. The patch was all she had to give her child as a connection to their heritage. Lieutenant Hartwell had promised to help. He had personally ensured that the infant was placed with an American family who had come to the region as missionaries and were returning to the United States. The adoption had been processed through official channels, but the chaos of the post-conflict period meant that many records were lost or incomplete. The baby's new family had been told only that her birth mother had died and that she was orphaned. General Hartwell had kept Li Mei Chen's patch for years, unsure what to do with it but unable to throw it away. Eventually, it had ended up in a box of military surplus items that he had donated to various organizations. He had never expected to see it again, and certainly not sewn onto a maintenance vest worn by a young woman whose features bore a striking resemblance to the dying mother he had tried to help 24 years earlier. Sarah waited patiently for an explanation, though the general's behavior was becoming increasingly unsettling. She had always been sensitive to tensions and conflicts, perhaps because her own life had been marked by an underlying sense of displacement that she had never been able to explain. Her adoptive parents had been kind and loving, but they had known little about her origins beyond the basic facts provided by the adoption agency. "What's your full name?" General Hartwell asked, his voice steady now but carrying an undertone of urgency. "Sarah Li Chen," she replied, wondering why this information was suddenly important. "Though my adoptive parents' name is Morrison, I kept Chen as a middle name because it was the only thing I knew about my background." The confirmation hit General Hartwell like a physical blow. The pieces of a puzzle he had not even known existed were falling into place with devastating clarity. The timing was right, the physical resemblance was undeniable, and now the name confirmed what he was beginning to suspect. This young woman was almost certainly the infant he had helped rescue 24 years ago. The silence stretched between them, heavy with implications that neither of them fully understood yet. Sarah could see that something profound was happening, though she could not comprehend what it might be. The general's face had gone through a series of expressions: shock, recognition, something that might have been guilt, and now a deep sadness that seemed to age him before her eyes. "I need to make some phone calls," General Hartwell said finally, his command voice returning but lacking its usual authority. "Miss Chen, I'd like you to remain here until I return. Don't remove that vest." "Sir, I don't understand," Sarah began, but the general was already walking away, his stride purposeful, but somehow different than when he had arrived. She watched him disappear through the armory's main exit, leaving her standing beside her workstation with a partially disassembled rifle and a growing sense that her life was about to change in ways she could not imagine. The other maintenance workers were staring now, their curiosity evident despite their attempts to appear focused on their own tasks. Sarah slowly sat back down, her hands shaking slightly as she picked up her cleaning supplies. The routine motion was comforting, but it could not quiet the questions that were beginning to multiply in her mind. She looked down at the patch that had caused such a dramatic reaction, seeing it clearly for perhaps the first time. The phoenix was beautifully rendered, its details crisp despite the fabric's age. The Chinese characters meant nothing to her. She had never learned to read the language, despite her grandmother's occasional suggestions that she should explore her heritage more deeply. Sarah's grandmother had always been vague about Sarah's origins, claiming that the adoption agency had provided little information. She had encouraged Sarah to be grateful for the family that had raised her, and not to dwell on a past that could not be changed. But now, as Sarah stared at the mysterious patch, she wondered if there might be more to her story than she had ever been told. The minutes ticked by with agonizing slowness. Sarah tried to focus on her work, but her concentration was completely shattered. The rifle component seemed foreign in her hands, and she found herself making small mistakes that she would normally never commit. Each time the armory door opened, she looked up hopefully, expecting to see General Hartwell's return. When he finally did return, he was not alone. A woman in civilian clothes accompanied him. Someone Sarah did not recognize but who carried herself with the purposeful manner of someone in an official capacity. They approached her workstation together, their expressions serious and concerned. "Miss Chen," General Hartwell said, his voice gentler now than it had been before. "This is Ms. Rodriguez from the Department of Veterans Affairs. We need to speak with you privately." Sarah's heart began to race. Nothing in her experience had prepared her for a situation like this, and the serious expressions on their faces suggested that whatever they had to tell her was significant. She nodded mutely, gathering her tools and securing the disassembled rifle according to standard procedures. As they led her toward a small office adjacent to the armory, Sarah caught a glimpse of her reflection in a window. The faded patch on her vest seemed to glow in the afternoon light, the phoenix appearing to spread its wings as if preparing to take flight. She had no idea that she was about to learn the truth about a promise made by a young soldier 24 years earlier, or that the mother she had never known had ensured that a piece of their shared heritage would somehow find its way back to her daughter. The office door closed behind them with a soft click, shutting out the familiar sounds of the armory, and marking the end of the only life Sarah had ever known. What lay ahead was a journey into a past she had never imagined, and a future that would be built on the foundation of truth, rather than the comfortable assumptions that had shaped her first 23 years. The small office felt suffocating, despite its adequate size. Sarah sat in a metal folding chair that squeaked every time she shifted her weight, her hands clasped tightly in her lap as General Hartwell and Ms. Rodriguez arranged themselves across from her. The fluorescent light above flickered intermittently, casting shifting shadows across their faces and making the moment feel surreal and disconnected from reality. Rodriguez opened a thin manila folder that she had been carrying, revealing what appeared to be photocopied documents and several photographs. Sarah could see that some of the papers bore official seals and letterheads, though she could not read the details from her position. The sight of such formal documentation made her stomach tighten with anxiety.
"Sarah," General Hartwell began, his voice carefully controlled, "what I'm about to tell you may be difficult to hear."
"I want you to know that we're going to take this slowly, and you can ask questions at any time." Sarah nodded, though she was not sure she was ready for whatever revelation was coming. The patch on her vest seemed to weigh more heavily than before, as if it had absorbed the gravity of the situation and was now pressing against her chest like a physical reminder of mysteries she had never thought to explore. 24 years ago, the general continued, I was a young lieutenant serving with an international relief operation in Southeast Asia, There had been ethnic violence in the region, and we were working to provide humanitarian aid to displaced families. As he spoke, Sarah found herself studying his face, searching for clues about where this story might be leading. General Hartwell was perhaps in his early 50s, with greying hair and the kind of weathered features that spoke of years spent in challenging conditions. His eyes held a weight that suggested he had seen things that most people would never experience. Ms. Rodriguez slid one of the photographs across the small table towards Sarah. It showed a refugee camp, rows of temporary shelters stretching across dusty ground, with people moving between them carrying bundles of belongings. The image was faded and slightly blurred, the kind of photograph that documented tragedy rather than celebration. The camp housed several hundred families, General Hartwell explained. Most had fled with nothing more than the clothes on their backs. Among them was a young mother named Li Mei Chen. The sound of her own surname spoken in this context made Sarah's breath catch in her throat. She stared at the photograph, trying to imagine what it might have been like to live in such conditions, to be displaced from everything familiar and safe.
Li Mei had been injured during her escape from the violence. Ms.
Rodriguez added, her professional demeanor softened by obvious compassion. She was traveling with her infant daughter, but her injuries were severe. The medical facilities at the camp were not equipped to handle her condition. Sarah felt a strange disconnection from her own body, as if she were watching this conversation happen to someone else. The words being spoken seemed to hover in the air around her, not quite settling into comprehension. She understood what was being said, but her mind was rejecting the implications. General Hartwell reached across the table and gently turned the photograph so that Sarah could see it more clearly. Li Mei knew that she was dying. Her greatest concern was ensuring that her daughter would be safe, that she would have a chance at a life free from the violence and displacement that had marked her own existence. Another photograph was placed before Sarah, this one showing a young Asian woman holding a baby. The woman's face was partially obscured by shadows, but her posture conveyed both tenderness and desperation. She was wearing clothing that looked makeshift and worn, clearly assembled from whatever had been available in the refugee camp. "This is the only photograph we have of Li Mei with her daughter," Ms. Rodriguez said softly. It was taken about a week before she died. Sarah stared at the image, her eyes tracing the outline of the baby in the woman's arms. The infant's face was turned away from the camera, but there was something about the shape of the tiny hands, the way the woman held her child, that made Sarah's chest feel tight with an emotion she could not name. "The night before Li Mei died," General Hartwell continued, his voice becoming strained with memory, "she asked to speak with me privately. She knew her time was running out, and she was desperate to make arrangements for her daughter's future." He paused, reaching into his uniform pocket and withdrawing a small object wrapped in tissue paper. With careful movements, he unwrapped what appeared to be another patch, identical to the one sewn onto Sarah's vest, but newer and better preserved. "Li Mei gave me this patch and begged me to help ensure that her daughter would be placed with a good family. She said it was all she had left of their heritage, and she wanted her child to have something that connected her to where she came from." Sarah's hand moved involuntarily to touch the patch on her own vest. The fabric felt different now, charged with significance that she was only beginning to understand. Her fingers traced the outline of the phoenix, and she found herself wondering if her birth mother's hands had once performed the same gesture. "I promised Li Mei that I would do everything in my power to help her daughter," General Hartwell said, his eyes meeting Sarah's directly. "Within hours of her death, we had arranged for the baby to be placed with an American missionary couple who were returning to the United States. The adoption was processed through official channels, but the chaos of that time meant that many records were incomplete or lost." Ms. Rodriguez opened another section of her folder and withdrew a document that was clearly an adoption certificate. Even from across the table, Sarah could see her own name typed in the appropriate spaces, along with information about her adoptive parents. "The family that adopted you was told that your birth mother had died and that you were orphaned," Ms. Rodriguez explained. They were not given details about the circumstances, as was common practice at the time. The goal was to help children move forward into new lives without being burdened by traumatic histories. Sarah found her voice, though it came out as barely more than a whisper. "You're telling me that you knew my birth mother?" General Hartwell nodded slowly. "I spent several hours with Li Mei during her final days. She was remarkable. Despite her pain and fear, her only concern was for your welfare. She wanted you to have opportunities that she could never provide. But she also wanted you to know that you came from people who valued family, heritage, and resilience." The room fell silent except for the humming of the fluorescent light overhead. Sarah felt as if she were falling through space, all of her assumptions about her life crumbling away to reveal a foundation she had never known existed. The story being told to her was both devastating and beautiful, filled with loss but also with hope. "The patch I kept for years," General Hartwell continued. "I didn't know what to do with it. Li Mei had said it should go to her daughter, but I had no way of tracking you down through the adoption system. Eventually, I donated it, along with other items, to a military surplus organization. I never imagined I would see it again, and certainly not." He gestured towards Sarah's vest, his expression mixing wonder with something that might have been guilt. "Not sewn onto a piece of equipment being worn by the very person it was meant for." Sarah looked down at the patch again, seeing it with completely new eyes. What had been merely a decorative element on her work clothing was now revealed as a deliberate message from a mother to her daughter, carried across decades and circumstances that defied explanation. "How can you be sure?" Sarah asked, her scientific mind struggling with the improbability of the situation. "How can you know that I'm really her daughter?" Ms. Rodriguez smiled gently and withdrew another document from her folder. "We've been able to cross-reference the adoption records with the refugee camp documentation. The dates match, the names match, and the physical description of the infant matches what we know about you. Additionally, there are some distinctive characteristics that we can verify." She showed Sarah a medical form that had been completed during her processing at the refugee camp. Among other details, it noted a small birthmark on the infant's left shoulder blade, a detail that Sarah knew applied to her, though she had never considered it significant. "Of course, Miss Principal," Rodriguez continued, "we can arrange for DNA testing if you would like definitive confirmation. But based on the circumstantial evidence, we're quite confident in our assessment." Sarah felt overwhelmed by the rush of information and emotions. Part of her wanted to reject the entire story, to insist that there had been some mistake and return to her simple life maintaining rifles in the armory. But a deeper part of her recognized something profound in what she was being told. A missing piece that she had not even known was absent until now. "What was she like?" Sarah asked suddenly, the question bursting out of her before she could consider whether it was appropriate. General Hartwell's expression softened, and for a moment the military bearing dropped away, to reveal the young man who had once made a promise to a dying mother. "She was extraordinary. Despite everything she had been through, she maintained a dignity and grace that impressed everyone who met her. She spoke some English, and she told me about her hopes for her daughter's future."
He paused, clearly accessing memories that he had not revisited in many years.
Li Mei said that she wanted her daughter to grow up strong and independent, but also connected to her heritage. She believed that understanding where you come from gives you strength to face whatever lies ahead. Sarah found tears forming in her eyes, though she was not sure if they were tears of sadness or relief. The image of her birth mother that was emerging from General Hartwell's memories was nothing like the vague fantasy she had occasionally entertained about her origins. This was a real person with real hopes and fears, someone who had made an ultimate sacrifice to ensure her child's survival. "She also said something else that stayed with me," General Hartwell added, his voice becoming very quiet. "She said that she believed her daughter would find a way to help people, just as so many people were helping them during that terrible time. She said it was important to pass on kindness whenever possible." The observation struck Sarah with particular force because she recognized the truth in it. Her choice to work maintaining military equipment had been driven partly by a desire to contribute to something larger than herself, to ensure that soldiers had reliable tools to protect themselves and others. She had never connected this impulse to her origins, but now it seemed possible that she had inherited more than just physical characteristics from her birth mother. Miss Rodriguez gathered the photographs and documents, but left them visible on the table between them. "Sarah, we want you to know that you have time to process all of this. There's no pressure to make any decisions or take any immediate action. We're simply here to provide you with information that we believe belongs to you." General Hartwell stood up, his movement breaking the intimate atmosphere that had developed during their conversation. "There is one more thing," he said, reaching again into his uniform pocket. "Li Mei asked me to give you a message if I ever had the opportunity to do so." He withdrew a small piece of paper, yellowed with age, and carefully folded. With reverent movements, he unfolded it, to reveal writing in both Chinese characters and English. The handwriting was shaky, clearly produced by someone who was ill and weak, but the words were legible. "She wrote this the night before she died," General Hartwell explained, holding the paper so that Sarah could see it. "She asked me to translate the Chinese characters into English so that her daughter would be able to understand the message, even if she never learned to read Chinese." Sarah leaned forward to read the English portion of the note. The words were simple but devastating in their emotional impact. My precious daughter, you are my greatest achievement and my greatest hope. Be brave, be kind, and remember that you carry the strength of all who came before you. Though we cannot be together, my love travels with you always. The tears that Sarah had been holding back finally began to fall, dropping onto the table and creating small dark spots on the manila folder. She felt as if a door that had been locked inside her heart had suddenly burst open, releasing emotions and longings that she had never allowed herself to acknowledge. General Hartwell placed the note on the table in front of her. This belongs to you, he said simply. Sarah reached out with trembling hands to touch the paper where her birth mother's fingers had once rested. The connection across time and tragedy felt both impossible and absolutely real. She was holding proof that she had been loved deeply and completely by someone who had given everything to ensure her survival. What happens now? Sarah asked, looking up at both of them through her tears. That's entirely up to you, Ms. Rodriguez replied. Some people in your situation want to learn everything they can about their origins. Others prefer to simply acknowledge the information and continue with their lives as they are. There's no right or wrong choice. General Hartwell moved toward the door, then stopped and turned back. Sarah, I want you to know that keeping my promise to your mother has been one of the most important things I've ever done, even though I didn't realize I was keeping it until today. Li Mei would be proud of the person you've become. As the door closed behind him, Sarah was left alone with Ms. Rodriguez and the scattered documents that had just rewritten her entire understanding of herself. The patch on her vest no longer felt like a random decoration. It was a deliberate gift from a mother to her daughter, a tangible connection that had somehow survived decades of separation and found its way home. The phoenix embroidered on the fabric suddenly made perfect sense. It was not just a decorative motif. It was a symbol of rebirth, of rising from destruction to create something new and beautiful. Sarah realized that she was living proof of that symbol's meaning. A person who had emerged from tragedy to build a life of purpose and meaning. Outside the small office, the armory continued its daily operations, soldiers and technicians going about their routines, unaware that one of their colleagues was experiencing a fundamental shift in understanding. Sarah sat quietly, holding her birth mother's note and contemplating the extraordinary chain of events that had brought this moment into existence. She understood now that her story was both more tragic and more beautiful than she had ever imagined. The sense of displacement that had always haunted her was finally explained, but so was the underlying strength that had carried her through challenges and uncertainties. She was the daughter of Li Mei Chen, a woman who had faced unimaginable hardship with courage and grace. As the afternoon sun slanted through the office's small window, Sarah began to consider what this revelation might mean for her future. The life she had built was not false or meaningless. It was the fulfillment of her birth mother's hopes and dreams. But now she had the opportunity to build upon that foundation with a deeper understanding of where she had come from and what she might become. The patch on her vest seemed to pulse with new meaning, the phoenix spreading its wings as if preparing to soar into whatever adventures lay ahead. The drive home from the military base felt like traveling through a different world. Sarah sat behind the wheel of her modest sedan, but her mind remained trapped in the small office where her entire life had been redefined in the span of an afternoon. The manila envelope containing copies of documents and photographs rested on the passenger seat beside her, a tangible reminder that the conversation had not been a dream or hallucination. Traffic moved slowly through the early evening rush, giving Sarah time to process the overwhelming information she had received. Every familiar landmark along her usual route seemed foreign now, as if learning about her origins had somehow altered the landscape of her entire existence. The fast food restaurants and strip malls that lined the highway looked different when viewed by someone who now knew she was the daughter of a refugee who had died in a camp thousands of miles away. Sarah's hands gripped the steering wheel tightly, her knuckles white with tension. The patch on her maintenance vest had been carefully removed before she left the base. General Hartwell had insisted that she take it with her, along with the matching patch that her birth mother had given him 24 years earlier. Both patches now rested in a small box on her lap, wrapped in tissue paper like precious relics. As she pulled into the driveway of the small house she shared with her grandmother, Sarah felt a complex mix of emotions washing over her. The modest two-bedroom home had been her refuge for the past 5 years, ever since her adoptive parents had been killed in a car accident and she had moved in to care for her aging grandmother. It was a place of comfort and routine, but now it felt charged with new significance. Grandmother Morrison sat in her usual chair by the living room window, watching for Sarah's return as she did every evening. At 83, she moved slowly and tired easily, but her mind remained sharp and her affection for Sarah was unwavering. She had been Sarah's primary source of emotional support since the death of her adoptive parents, providing stability during a period when Sarah's life had felt unmoored and uncertain. "You're late today, dear," Grandmother Morrison observed as Sarah entered through the front door. "I was beginning to worry." Sarah set down her purse and the small box containing the patches, trying to organize her thoughts into something coherent. How could she possibly explain what had happened? How could she convey the magnitude of what she had learned without completely overwhelming the elderly woman who had become so important to her stability? "Something unexpected happened at work," Sarah said, settling into the chair across from her grandmother. "Something important." Grandmother Morrison studied Sarah's face with the perceptive gaze of someone who had lived long enough to recognize when significant news was being delivered. "You look upset, sweetheart. What's wrong?" Sarah reached for the small box and carefully removed the 2 phoenix patches, placing them on the coffee table between them. The late afternoon sunlight streaming through the window caught the embroidered details, making the mythical bird seem almost alive.
"I learned something today about where I came from," Sarah began, her voice steady despite the emotional turbulence she felt.
"About my birth mother." The old woman's expression shifted to one of careful attention. Sarah's origins had always been a sensitive topic in their household, not because anyone wanted to hide information, but because there had simply been so little to share. The adoption had been processed through an agency that specialized in international placements, but the documentation had been minimal and the agency had since closed. Sarah told her grandmother everything that had happened, from the moment General Hartwell had noticed the patch on her vest to the final conversation in the small office. She described the photographs of the refugee camp, the story of Li Mei Chen's final days, and the message that had been preserved for more than 2 decades. Grandmother Morrison listened without interruption, her weathered hands folded in her lap and her eyes fixed on Sarah's face. Occasionally she glanced at the patches on the coffee table, as if trying to reconcile these physical artifacts with the story she was hearing. "My word," she said softly when Sarah finished speaking. "After all these years, to think that such a connection would reveal itself in such an unexpected way." Sarah nodded, still struggling to fully believe the events herself. "I keep thinking there must be some mistake, that it's too much of a coincidence. But all the evidence fits together perfectly. The dates, the names, even the physical details. Sometimes life presents us with coincidences that are so remarkable they seem impossible." Grandmother Morrison replied thoughtfully, "But perhaps they're not coincidences at all. Perhaps they're simply the universe's way of ensuring that important truths eventually come to light." The 2 women sat in contemplative silence for several minutes, both lost in their own thoughts about the implications of Sarah's discovery. The patches seemed to glow in the fading daylight, their symbolic significance now impossible to ignore. "I should call my parents about this," Sarah said suddenly, then caught herself. "I mean, my adoptive parents." The correction felt awkward and necessary. The revelation about her birth mother had not diminished her love for the people who had raised her, but it had complicated her understanding of family and belonging. Grandmother Morrison reached across the small distance between their chairs and took Sarah's hand in her own. "Your parents loved you deeply, dear. They would be fascinated by this discovery, not threatened by it. They always encouraged you to learn about your heritage when you were ready." Sarah nodded, remembering conversations from her teenage years when her curiosity about her origins had been strongest. Her adoptive parents had been supportive of her questions while honestly acknowledging the limitations of what they knew. They had encouraged her to pursue information if she felt it was important, but they had also reassured her that their love was not conditional on her background or circumstances. "What do you think I should do?" Sarah asked, seeking guidance from the woman whose wisdom had helped her navigate other difficult decisions. "What does your heart tell you?" Grandmother Morrison replied, in the way that wise older women often answer questions with questions. Sarah considered the question seriously, trying to separate her emotional reactions from her practical concerns. Part of her wanted to dive deeply into research about her birth mother and the circumstances that had led to her adoption. Another part of her felt overwhelmed by the implications and wanted to maintain the stable life she had built. "I think I want to learn more," Sarah said slowly. "Not because I'm unhappy with my life, but because understanding where I came from might help me understand where I'm going." Grandmother Morrison smiled and squeezed Sarah's hand. "That sounds like a very wise approach, dear. Just remember that learning about your past doesn't require you to abandon your present." That evening, Sarah spread the documents and photographs across her bedroom desk, creating a timeline of events that connected her birth in a refugee camp to her current life as a weapons maintenance specialist. The story that emerged was both heartbreaking and inspiring. a testament to the power of love to transcend circumstances and the importance of promises kept across decades. She studied the photograph of Li Mei Chen holding her infant daughter, searching for recognizable features or familiar expressions. While the image quality was poor and the lighting inadequate, Sarah thought she could detect similarities in the shape of their hands and the curve of their jawlines. More importantly, she recognized something in her birth mother's posture, a combination of tenderness and determination that Sarah felt she had inherited. The message that Li Mei had written was perhaps the most powerful artifact in the collection. Sarah read it repeatedly, each time discovering new layers of meaning in the simple but profound words. The instruction to be brave, be kind, and remember that you carry the strength of all who came before you felt like a roadmap for living that resonated with values Sarah had developed independently. As the evening progressed, Sarah found herself thinking about General Hartwell and the promise he had made to a dying woman. The fact that he had kept Li Mei's patch for over 20 years, unsure what to do with it but unable to throw it away, suggested a depth of character that extended far beyond his military duties. The coincidence of their meeting in the armory felt less like random chance and more like the fulfillment of a destiny that had been set in motion decades earlier. Sarah also reflected on her work maintaining military equipment and how it might connect to her heritage. Li Mei Chen had been a victim of violence, someone who had lost everything due to conflict she had no power to influence. Sarah's choice to work supporting military operations could be seen as a way of honoring her birth mother's memory, ensuring that those who served had reliable tools to protect themselves and others. The next morning brought a return to routine that felt simultaneously comforting and surreal. Sarah dressed for work in her usual clothes, but the absence of the maintenance vest created an immediate reminder of the previous day's revelations. She had been given permission to take several days off to process the information she had received, but she had chosen to maintain her normal schedule as a way of anchoring herself during a period of emotional turbulence. At the military base, word of the unusual discovery had spread among the staff, though the details remained confidential. Sarah found herself the subject of curious glances and whispered conversations, though her colleagues were respectful of her privacy. Master Sergeant Rodriguez approached her during the morning break, his expression mixing concern with fascination. "I heard something remarkable happened yesterday," he said, settling into the chair beside her workstation. "Are you doing all right?" Sarah nodded, though she was not entirely sure how to answer the question honestly. "It's a lot to process, but I'm managing. The whole situation feels so improbable that sometimes I wonder if I imagined it." "Sometimes the most important things in life seem improbable when they happen," Rodriguez replied. "The fact that you ended up wearing that specific patch, working at this specific base, and encountered the one person who could recognize its significance, that's the kind of story that makes you believe in something larger than coincidence." His observation echoed thoughts that Sarah had been having since the previous afternoon. The chain of events that had led to her reunion with her birth mother's legacy was so complex and unlikely that it seemed to suggest some kind of intentional design. Whether that design came from fate, divine intervention, or simply the persistence of love across time and distance was impossible to determine. During her lunch break, Sarah called the number that Miss Cabrin, Rodriguez, had provided for accessing additional resources and support. The woman who answered was warm and knowledgeable, explaining the various options available for people in Sarah's situation. These included counseling services, genealogical research assistance, and connections with organizations that worked with refugees and adoptees. "Many people find it helpful to take things one step at a time," the counselor explained. "You don't need to make all your decisions immediately. Some people benefit from professional counseling to process their emotions, while others prefer to focus on research and fact-gathering first." Sarah appreciated the non-directive approach, which allowed her to maintain control over her own process of discovery and integration. She scheduled an appointment with a counselor who specialized in adoption-related issues, recognizing that she would likely need professional support to navigate the complex emotions that were emerging. That afternoon, General Hartwell stopped by the armory to check on Sarah's well-being. His demeanor was more personal than it had been during their previous official interactions, reflecting the unique bond that had been created through their shared connection to Li Mei Chen's story. "I've been thinking about our conversation yesterday," he said, taking a seat across from her workstation. "I realize this situation has created a significant disruption in your life, and I want to make sure you have all the support you need." Sarah looked up from the rifle she was cleaning, appreciating his continued concern. "I'm grateful for everything you've shared with me, sir. It's challenging to process, but I wouldn't want to go back to not knowing." General Hartwell nodded thoughtfully. "I've contacted some colleagues who were involved in the relief operations during that period. There may be additional photographs or documentation that could provide more context about your mother's life before the refugee camp. The possibility of learning more about Li Mei Chen's background was both exciting and daunting. Sarah realized that each new piece of information would require emotional processing and integration into her evolving understanding of herself. But the opportunity to develop a more complete picture of her birth mother's life felt too important to pass up. "I would appreciate any additional information you can find," Sarah said. "I'm beginning to understand that learning about my past is going to be a long process, but I want to approach it thoughtfully and completely."
General Hartwell smiled and stood up to leave.
"Your mother would be proud of your measured approach to this discovery, Sarah. She was someone who valued careful consideration and wise decision-making." As the afternoon progressed, Sarah found herself thinking about the broader implications of her story. She was not just an individual who had learned something important about her personal history. She was also a representative of countless other refugees and adoptees whose stories remained untold. The circumstances that had led to her birth mother's death were still occurring around the world, creating new generations of displaced children who would grow up with questions about their origins. The thought gave Sarah a sense of responsibility that extended beyond her personal situation. Perhaps her experience could be used to help others who found themselves in similar circumstances, either through advocacy work or by sharing her story to raise awareness about refugee issues. Li Mei Chen's message about passing on kindness whenever possible seemed particularly relevant in this context.
That evening, Sarah called her adoptive parents' closest friends, people who had remained in contact with her after the funeral and who had known details about her adoption that her parents had shared over the years.
The conversations were emotional but illuminating, providing additional context about the circumstances that had brought her to her adoptive family. "Your parents were so excited when they learned they would be able to adopt you," Mrs. Patterson recalled, her voice warm with memory. "They had been hoping for a child for so many years, and they saw your arrival as a blessing. They always said you were meant to be part of their family." The perspective helped Sarah understand that her discovery about Li Mei Chen did not diminish the love and intentionality that had surrounded her adoption. Instead, it revealed a complex web of love, sacrifice, and hope that connected multiple families across time and geography. She was the beneficiary of love from both her birth mother, who had given everything to ensure her survival, and her adoptive parents, who had provided her with opportunities and support throughout her childhood and young adulthood. As Sarah prepared for bed that night, she placed both phoenix patches on her nightstand where she could see them in the morning. The symbols seemed to glow in the lamplight, reminding her that she was living proof of rebirth and resilience. Tomorrow would bring new opportunities to explore her heritage and consider how this knowledge might shape her future decisions. The young woman who fell asleep that night was fundamentally different from the one who had awakened that morning. She was still Sarah Chen Morrison, but now she understood that her identity encompassed multiple layers of history, culture, and love that she had never known existed. The patch that had seemed like mere decoration was now revealed as a bridge between past and future, connecting her to a legacy of strength and sacrifice that would influence her choices for years to come. 3 weeks after the discovery that changed everything, Sarah found herself standing in the lobby of the International Refugee Services building, clutching a folder containing everything she had learned about her origins. The modern glass structure housed multiple organizations dedicated to helping displaced persons, and Sarah had come here seeking connections to her birth mother's community and culture. Dr. Elena Vasquez, the organization's research coordinator, greeted Sarah with a warm smile and led her through a maze of offices filled with case files and world maps marked with pins indicating global displacement patterns. The walls displayed photographs of families reuniting, children in school settings, and adults receiving job training. "I've been looking forward to our meeting," Dr. Vasquez said as they settled into her office. "General Hartwell contacted us about your situation, and we've done some preliminary research based on the information you provided." Sarah felt her heart rate increase with anticipation. The past 3 weeks had been a whirlwind of appointments with counselors, genealogical researchers, and cultural organizations. Each meeting had revealed new layers of complexity to her story, but she felt ready now to delve deeper into understanding her heritage. Vasquez opened a thick file folder and spread several documents across her desk. "We've been able to identify the specific village where your birth mother lived before the displacement. It was called Shaoshan, located in a mountainous region that was unfortunately caught in the middle of ethnic tensions during the late 1990s. The name meant nothing to Sarah, but seeing it written in both Chinese characters and English transliteration gave her a strange sense of connection to a place she had never seen. Dr. Vasquez showed her satellite images of the area, pointing out geographical features and explaining the agricultural practices that had sustained the community for generations. The people of Shaoshan were primarily farmers and artisans, Dr. Vasquez continued. They were known particularly for their textile work and their traditional healing practices. Your birth mother's family name, Chen, was very common in that region and typically indicated a family line that had been involved in scholarly or administrative work. Sarah studied a photograph of the village taken before the conflict, showing traditional buildings nestled among terraced hillsides. The scene was peaceful and timeless, giving no indication of the violence that would eventually destroy this way of life. She tried to imagine Li Mei Chen as a young woman growing up in such a place, learning skills and traditions that connected her to centuries of cultural continuity. We've also been able to locate some survivors from Shaoshan who eventually settled in various countries around the world. Dr. Rabia, Vasquez said, producing another set of documents. There are small communities of people from your birth mother's village, now living in Canada, Australia, and several cities in the United States. The possibility of connecting with people who had known her birth mother, or who at least shared her cultural background, was both exciting and terrifying. Sarah had spent her entire life feeling somewhat disconnected from any specific cultural identity, and the prospect of discovering an authentic community was overwhelmingly appealing. There's something else, Dr. Vasquez added, reaching into a separate folder. We were able to contact the refugee camp where your mother died, and they still have some personal belongings that were never claimed. The items have been preserved in their archives, waiting for family members to retrieve them. Sarah's breath caught in her throat. The idea that physical objects touched by her birth mother might still exist seemed almost impossible after so many years. What kind of belongings? A small cloth bag containing some jewelry, a handwritten journal, and what appears to be a collection of traditional medicines or herbs, Dr. Vasquez explained. The camp administrators have agreed to transfer these items to you if you can provide proper identification and verification of your relationship to Li Mei Chen. The prospect of reading her birth mother's journal felt monumentally significant. While General Hartwell's memories and the official documentation had provided important factual information about Li Mei's final days, her personal writings might reveal her thoughts, feelings, and experiences in her own voice. We can help you arrange for the transfer, Dr. Juch, Vasquez continued. We can also connect you with translators if the journal is written in Chinese, and with cultural experts who can help you understand the significance of the other items. Sarah nodded eagerly, though part of her felt overwhelmed by the rapid progression of discoveries. Each new piece of information seemed to open additional avenues for exploration, creating a complex web of connections that extended far beyond her individual story. Dr. Vasquez, can I ask you something personal? Sarah said, gathering courage to voice a question that had been troubling her. Do you think it's wrong that I'm just now learning about all of this? I feel like I should have tried harder to find information about my origins years ago. The older woman's expression softened with understanding. Sarah, there is no right timeline for these discoveries. Many people in your situation never learn anything about their backgrounds. The fact that this information has come to you now, in the way that it has, suggests that you're ready to receive and process it appropriately. Her reassurance helped ease some of the guilt that Sarah had been carrying about her previous lack of curiosity regarding her heritage. She realized that her adoptive parents had given her such a secure and loving foundation that she had not felt compelled to search for additional sources of identity until circumstances forced the issue. That afternoon, Sarah met with Wei Lin, a translator and cultural consultant who specialized in helping diaspora communities maintain connections to their heritage. Wei Lin was a woman in her 40s who had immigrated to the United States as a teenager and had built a career helping others navigate between traditional and contemporary identities. The phoenix symbol on your mother's patch is particularly significant, Wei Lin explained, examining the embroidered design with expert attention. In Chinese mythology, the phoenix represents rebirth, renewal, and the triumph of virtue over adversity. It's often associated with feminine power and the ability to rise above difficult circumstances. Sarah found herself thinking about the symbolic appropriateness of her birth mother choosing this particular image. Li Mei Chen had faced circumstances that would have destroyed many people, but she had found ways to ensure that something beautiful and meaningful would emerge from tragedy. The characters beneath the phoenix say, "Forever in our hearts," Wei Lin continued. But the calligraphy style suggests that your mother had formal education and training in traditional writing. This indicates that she came from a family that valued learning and cultural preservation. The information added depth to Sarah's evolving understanding of her heritage. Li Mei Chen was not just a refugee who had suffered displacement. She was someone who had been educated and culturally sophisticated before circumstances forced her to flee her homeland.
Would you be interested in learning to read Chinese characters?
Wei Lin asked. It might help you feel more connected to your heritage, and it would allow you to read your birth mother's journal without relying on translations. Sarah considered the suggestion seriously.
Learning a new language as an adult would be challenging and time-consuming, but it would also provide a direct connection to her cultural heritage that she could never achieve through translation alone.
I think I would like to try, Sarah said. Not just because of the journal, but because it seems like something my birth mother would have wanted me to learn. Over the following days, Sarah threw herself into learning about Chinese culture, language, and history. She purchased books about traditional medicine, cooking, and philosophy, trying to understand the world that had shaped Li Mei Chen's perspective and values. The process was overwhelming at times, but it also felt like coming home to a part of herself that had always existed but had never been acknowledged. The arrangement to retrieve her birth mother's belongings took several weeks to complete, involving paperwork, verification processes, and coordination between multiple organizations. When the package finally arrived via secure courier, Sarah felt as if she were about to open a time capsule that would transport her directly into Li Mei Chen's life and thoughts. Grandmother Morrison sat beside Sarah as she carefully opened the sealed container, offering moral support for what promised to be an emotionally intense experience. The first item they encountered was a small silk pouch containing pieces of jade jewelry, earrings, a bracelet, and a pendant carved in the shape of a lotus flower. "These are beautiful," Grandmother Morrison observed, holding one of the earrings up to the light. "The craftsmanship is exquisite." Sarah tried on the bracelet, marveling at how perfectly it fit her wrist. The jade felt warm against her skin, as if it retained some essence of the woman who had worn it before. She imagined Li Mei Chen putting on these same pieces of jewelry, perhaps preparing for special occasions in a village that no longer existed. The journal was wrapped in protective paper and tied with a faded ribbon. When Sarah opened the cover, she was confronted with pages of delicate Chinese characters written in ink that had faded to brown over the years. Even without being able to read the words, she could sense the personality behind the handwriting: careful, graceful, and deliberate. "I'll take this to Wei Lin for translation," Sarah said, though part of her wanted to attempt reading it herself immediately. "But first, I want to just sit with it for a while." The third item was a collection of small cloth packets containing dried herbs and plant materials that still retained faint fragrances despite their age. Each packet was labeled with Chinese characters and included notes about preparation and usage. Sarah realized that her birth mother had been knowledgeable about traditional medicine, adding another dimension to her understanding of the woman who had given her life. That evening, Sarah carefully arranged Li Mei Chen's belongings on her bedroom dresser, creating a small shrine that connected her to her heritage. The jade jewelry caught the lamplight and seemed to glow within a fire, while the journal rested open to a page covered with graceful characters that held mysteries she was determined to unlock. She spent hours studying the photographs Dr. Vasquez had provided of Shaoshan village, trying to imagine what daily life might have been like for her birth mother before displacement shattered that world. The terraced hillsides and traditional architecture represented a way of life that had been sustained for generations, making its destruction even more tragic. Sarah also began researching the broader historical context that had led to the violence in Li Mei Chen's region. She learned about ethnic tensions, economic pressures, and political instabilities that had combined to create conditions where peaceful farming communities could be transformed into refugee camps overnight. Understanding these larger forces helped her appreciate the courage her birth mother had shown in protecting her infant daughter under such circumstances. The next morning brought an unexpected phone call from Dr. W. Vasquez. "Sarah, I have some remarkable news," she said, her voice carrying barely contained excitement. "We've located someone who knew your birth mother personally." Sarah's hand tightened around the phone. "Someone who knew her? How is that possible?" "Her name is Mrs. Liu Xiaoping, and she was Li Mei's neighbor in Xiaoshan village. She escaped during the same conflict and eventually settled in San Francisco. When we contacted the Survivor Network, she immediately remembered Li Mei Chen and was devastated to learn what had happened to her. The possibility of speaking with someone who had actually known her birth mother as a person rather than just a refugee case felt almost surreal. Sarah realized that Mrs. Liu might be able to provide insights into Li Mei's personality, interests, and daily life that no official documentation could capture.
Mrs. Dead adds 2 Virgo.
Liu is elderly now, but she's very eager to speak with you, Dr. Vasquez continued. She says she has photographs and stories that she's been saving in hopes that Li Mei's family might someday be found. Sarah scheduled a phone call with Mrs. Liu for the following weekend, giving herself time to prepare emotionally for what promised to be an intense conversation. She spent the intervening days working with Wei Lin to learn basic Chinese phrases that might help her connect with Mrs. Mitchell Liu, even though the older woman reportedly spoke adequate English. When the appointed time arrived, Sarah sat in her living room, with Grandmother Morrison beside her for support, her hand trembling slightly as she dialed the number Dr. Gol Vasquez had provided. The phone rang several times before a gentle voice answered in accented English. "Hello, this is Mrs. Liu."
Mrs. Tao.
"Liu, this is Sarah Chen Morrison. I believe Dr. Vasquez told you about me." There was a pause, followed by what sounded like a sharp intake of breath. "Oh, my dear child," Mrs. Liu said, her voice thick with emotion. "You sound so much like your mother when she was excited about something. Li Mei always spoke with such hope about her daughter's future." The observation brought immediate tears to Sarah's eyes. To be told that she resembled her birth mother in some way felt like receiving a precious gift, a confirmation that the connection between them transcended the physical artifacts and official documents. Mrs. Acacia. "Liu, could you tell me about my mother? What was she like as a person?" "Liu Mei was sunshine, Mrs. Call," Leah replied without hesitation. Even during difficult times, she found reasons to laugh and help others feel better. She was very smart. She could read and write better than most people in our village, and she knew all the old stories and songs that connected us to our ancestors. Sarah listened intently as Mrs. Moen too. Liu painted a picture of Li Mei Chen as a vibrant young woman who had been actively involved in preserving cultural traditions and helping her neighbors solve practical problems. The image that emerged was of someone who had been deeply rooted in her community, while also possessing the intellectual curiosity and adaptability that had helped her survive under impossible circumstances. She talked about her baby constantly during those final weeks, Mrs. Liu continued, her voice becoming softer. "She was so proud of you and so determined that you would have opportunities that had been taken away from us. She said she wanted you to grow up strong and educated, but also kind and connected to your heritage." The conversation continued for over an hour, with Mrs. Liu sharing stories that brought Li Mei Chen to life as a complete person rather than just a tragic figure. Sarah learned about her birth mother's love of singing, her skill at growing vegetables, and her habit of collecting unusual stones that she believed brought good luck. "I have something for you, Mrs. Peach," Liu said as their conversation was drawing to a close. "A photograph of Li Mei from before everything went wrong. She's standing in her garden, holding the vegetables she was most proud of. She looks so happy and hopeful. The prospect of seeing her birth mother healthy and content, living the life she had been meant to live before tragedy intervened, felt like an incredible gift." Sarah arranged for Mrs. Doria Liu to mail the photograph, along with other mementos she had preserved from their shared village life. As Sarah hung up the phone, she felt as if she had been given access to a dimension of her birth mother's existence that she had never imagined. Li Mei Chen was no longer just a courageous woman who had died protecting her child. She was someone with a complete personality, interests, and relationships that had defined her life before displacement changed everything. The journey of discovery that had begun with a patch on a work vest was evolving into something much more comprehensive and meaningful. Sarah was not just learning facts about her origins. She was developing a relationship with a heritage that would influence her choices and perspectives for the rest of her life. 6 months after the discovery that changed her life forever, Sarah stood before a gathering of over 200 people in the community center of the International Refugee Services Building. The audience included refugees from dozens of countries, adoptees searching for their origins, military personnel, and community volunteers. In her hands, she held both phoenix patches, the one that had been sewn onto her work vest and the one General Hartwell had preserved for 24 years. The event was a symposium on lost connections and found heritage, organized by Dr. Vasquez and several partner organizations to highlight stories of successful reunification between displaced persons and their cultural roots. Sarah had been invited to share her experience as the keynote speaker, a responsibility that felt both honored and daunting. 3 years ago, if someone had told me I would be standing here talking about my birth mother's courage and the power of preserved promises, I would have thought they were describing someone else's life. Sarah began, her voice carrying clearly through the microphone.
"I thought I knew who I was. a weapons maintenance specialist who lived quietly with her grandmother and had few questions about her past.
In the front row sat General Hartwell, now retired, but still carrying himself with the bearing of someone accustomed to leadership. Beside him was Mrs.
Liu, who had traveled from San Francisco to attend the event and meet Sarah in person for the first time. Grandmother Morrison occupied a seat of honor near the podium, her eyes bright with pride as she watched Sarah address the assembled crowd. The phoenix on these patches has become a symbol not just of my mother's hopes for my future, but of the resilience that lives within all of us who have been touched by displacement, loss, or separation from our roots. Sarah continued, holding up the embroidered designs so the audience could see them. Li Mei Chen died believing that love could transcend circumstances, and that meaningful connections could survive even when everything else was lost. Over the past 6 months, Sarah's life had been transformed in ways that extended far beyond her personal understanding of her heritage. Working with Wei Lin, she had achieved basic conversational ability in Mandarin and had successfully translated portions of her birth mother's journal. The writings revealed a thoughtful, spiritual woman who had found strength in traditional wisdom while adapting to modern challenges. The journal entries from Li Mei's final weeks were particularly moving, filled with observations about the other refugees in the camp and detailed instructions about how she wanted her daughter to be raised. Teach her to be proud of where she comes from but not limited by it, one entry read. Help her understand that she carries the hopes of many generations, but that her life is her own to shape. Sarah had also made contact with several other survivors from Xiaoshan village, creating a network of people who shared memories of the community that had shaped her birth mother's early years. Through video calls and email exchanges, she had learned traditional recipes, cultural customs, and family stories that connected her to a heritage extending back centuries. Perhaps most significantly, Sarah had made the decision to change her career direction. Working with refugee organizations had revealed a passion for helping displaced persons navigate the complex process of cultural preservation and adaptation. She had enrolled in graduate school to study international social work, with a focus on trauma recovery and heritage preservation. My birth mother's belongings included packets of traditional medicines that she had carefully preserved even as she fled for her life, Sarah told the assembled audience. Each packet was labeled with instructions for preparation and usage, representing knowledge that had been passed down through generations of healers. She saved these medicines not because she expected to use them herself, but because she hoped they might someday benefit her daughter or her daughter's community. The reference to traditional medicines had led to one of Sarah's most meaningful discoveries. Working with university researchers, she had identified several of the plant materials in Li Mei's collection as containing compounds that modern pharmaceutical research had validated for treating anxiety and digestive disorders. The knowledge that her birth mother had possessed sophisticated understanding of healing practices added another layer to Sarah's appreciation of her heritage. Sarah had also used her growing language skills to connect with contemporary communities of people from her birth mother's region who had settled in various parts of the world. Through online forums and cultural organizations, she had developed friendships with second and third generation immigrants who shared similar experiences of navigating between traditional heritage and contemporary identity. One of the most important lessons I've learned during this journey, Sarah continued, is that heritage is not something you either have or lack. It's something you actively choose to cultivate and preserve. My adoptive parents gave me a foundation of love and opportunity that allowed me to pursue these discoveries from a position of security rather than desperation. The acknowledgement of her adoptive family drew appreciative murmurs from the audience, many of whom were grappling with similar questions about balancing loyalty to adoptive families with curiosity about biological origins. Sarah had worked with counselors to process the complex emotions surrounding her dual identity, eventually reaching a place of integration rather than conflict. General Hartwell had become an unexpected mentor during Sarah's journey of discovery. His experiences in humanitarian work had given him insights into the long-term effects of displacement, and he had shared stories about other families he had encountered whose separations had created lasting wounds across generations. Their conversations had helped Sarah understand that her story, while unique in its specific details, represented a broader pattern of loss and recovery that affected millions of people worldwide. General Hartwell kept my birth mother's patch for 24 years, without knowing whether he would ever be able to fulfill his promise to her, Sarah said, gesturing toward the retired officer. His faithfulness to that commitment, even when it seemed impossible to complete, demonstrates the power of intention and hope to create connections across time and circumstance. The general nodded in acknowledgement, his eyes reflecting the satisfaction of a mission finally completed. In the months since their first meeting, he had worked with Sarah to establish a scholarship fund for children of refugees who were pursuing higher education. The fund was named in honor of Li Mei Chen and was designed to help young people maintain connections to their heritage while building successful lives in their adopted countries. Sarah's relationship with Mrs. Liu had become particularly precious, providing her with a living connection to her birth mother's personality and daily life. The elderly woman had shared photographs, recipes, and stories that brought Li Mei Chen to life as a complete person, rather than just a symbol of tragedy and courage. Their regular phone conversations had become a source of cultural education and emotional support for Sarah. Mrs. Liu has taught me that preserving heritage is not about perfectly replicating the past, Sarah explained, smiling toward her birth mother's former neighbor. It's about understanding the values and wisdom that sustained our ancestors, and then finding ways to apply those principles to contemporary challenges. The audience included several other adoptees who were in various stages of their own journeys of discovery, and Sarah had made sure to address their experiences directly. Through support groups and informal networks, she had learned that each person's path toward understanding their origins was unique, requiring different levels of research, emotional processing, and cultural integration. Some people ask me whether learning about my birth mother has made me feel more complete, Sarah said, approaching the conclusion of her presentation. The answer is complicated, because I realize now that I was never incomplete. I was simply uninformed about parts of my own story. The knowledge I've gained has not filled empty spaces in my identity. It has revealed connections and possibilities that were always there but had been invisible to me. Sarah held up Li Mei Chen's journal, which she had learned to read with increasing fluency over the past several months. My mother wrote that she hoped her daughter would grow up to help people who were experiencing the same kinds of challenges that our family faced. At the time, I was working as a weapons maintenance specialist, ensuring that military equipment functioned properly to protect those who serve. Now I understand that there are many different ways to fulfill her hopes for my life. The transition from military contracting to refugee services had required significant adjustments, both financial and professional. Sarah had returned to school while continuing to work part-time, relying on scholarships and support from her extended network to manage the change. The Phoenix patches had been carefully preserved and now occupied a place of honor in her apartment, reminding her daily of the journey that had brought her to this new path. The most remarkable thing about this entire experience, Sarah continued, has been discovering that my birth mother's love and hopes for my future were not diminished by the tragic circumstances of her death. If anything, the challenges she faced seemed to have intensified her determination that her sacrifice would create opportunities for beauty and meaning. Sarah's story had attracted media attention, resulting in newspaper articles and television interviews that had connected her with dozens of other people in similar situations. She had received letters from adoptees around the world, military personnel who had worked in humanitarian operations, and refugees who are struggling to maintain connections to their heritage while adapting to new countries. The correspondence had led to her involvement in several advocacy organizations working to improve record-keeping and communication systems that could help separated families maintain connections. Sarah had testified before legislative committees about the importance of preserving cultural artifacts and personal belongings during refugee processing, ensuring that future families would have better access to information about their origins. I want to close by reading something my birth mother wrote in her journal just days before she died, Sarah said, opening the small book to a page she had marked with a ribbon bookmark. She wrote this in Chinese, and I've translated it as carefully as possible.
Sarah cleared her throat and read in both Chinese and English, her pronunciation still imperfect but improved dramatically from her first attempts months earlier.
My daughter will grow up in a world very different from the one that shaped me, but she will carry within her the strength and wisdom of all who came before her.
I pray that she will find ways to use her gifts, not just for her own happiness, but to help others who face the kinds of challenges that have marked our family's journey. May she be a bridge between worlds, helping others find their way home. The silence that followed was broken by applause that began slowly and built to a sustained ovation. Sarah looked out over the audience, seeing faces that reflected their own experiences of loss, discovery, and hope. She realized that her story had become more than just a personal journey of discovery. It had become a testament to the power of love to transcend circumstances and the importance of preserving connections across generations. After the formal presentation, Sarah spent time talking with individual audience members, many of whom shared their own stories of separation and reunion. She was struck by the diversity of experiences represented in the room, from Korean War orphans who had spent decades searching for information about their families, to recent refugees who were struggling to maintain cultural practices while adapting to new environments.
General Hartwell approached her during the reception, his expression mixing pride with something that might have been wonder.
"Sarah, your mother would be amazed by the woman you've become," he said, his voice carrying the emotion of someone who had witnessed the completion of a promise made under impossible circumstances. "Thank you for keeping your word to her," Sarah replied, reaching out to clasp his hand. "Without your faithfulness to that commitment, I would never have learned about the love and hope that shaped my earliest days." Mrs. Liu joined their conversation, her eyes bright with tears but her expression joyful. "Li Mei always said that love finds a way to continue even after death," she said in her careful English. Today, I understand what she meant. As the evening wound down, Sarah found herself standing with Grandmother Morrison in the lobby of the building, looking at a display of photographs from refugee camps around the world. The images were difficult,